I would go in a slightly different direction and emphasize something that does not lean on quantum mechanics, does not lean on stochasticity, and does not lean on hyperturing or anything like that. Let's and also let's even step back from the living, because living thing, conventional living things are so complex that you can always find more mechanisms and so on. I want to look at an extremely minimal model, and the reason that we chose this was precisely because it's such a minimal model. I wanted to sort of maximize the shock value of this thing for our intuitions. And this is the work that my student Taining Zhang and Adam Goldstein and I did on sorting algorithms, which is what Anil mentioned. And there's a couple more things like it coming in the next few months. The sorting algorithm is it's like bubble sort, selection sort, these kinds of things. CS students in CS 101 have been studying these for, I don't know, 60 years probably. And no one, as far as I can tell, no one noticed what we noticed, because the assumption has always been this thing does what we asked it to do. And a lot of what I'm trying to emphasize is specifically running against that assumption that, yeah, it sorts the numbers all right, but if you back off from this assumption that all it does is what the steps of the algorithm ask it to do, then you find some new things. And computer scientists are well aware of emergent complexity, emergent unpredictability. Cellular automata do all kinds of funky things, and some of the rules are chaotic and all this kind of stuff. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about emergent complexity, unpredictability, or even perverse instantiation, which A-life people find all the time. I'm talking about things that any behavioral scientist would recognize as within their domain if you didn't tell them that this came from a deterministic algorithm. And so I can go into details if you want, but a couple of things are salient here. What these algorithms are also doing while they're sorting your numbers are also a couple of interesting, I call them side quests, because there are no steps in the algorithm asking them to do this. In fact, if you try to write an algorithm to force them to do it, it would be a whole bunch of extra work, which is actually quite interesting, because I think we're getting free compute here. That's a whole other thing that I think is a very testable. It's a crazy, and it's a nice testable prediction, because it's so weird and unexpected. They are doing some other things that are not directly related to what you've asked them to do. That's really important, because it means that these language models, for example, when we say AI nowadays, a lot of people think language models. People tend to assume that the thing that the language model talks about is some kind of clue as to its inner nature, right? And people say, well, my GPT said to me that it was conscious or wasn't conscious or whatever. My point is, the thing you force it to do may have zero to do with what's actually going on. Now, in biologicals, that's not true, because evolution, I think, works really hard to make sure that the signs that we and the communications that we do are related to our inner state and things like that. So in biology, those things are tied closely together. But I think we've disconnected them, and what we are now making are things that look like they're talking and whatever, and they are. But I'm not sure any of those things are at all a guide to what's going on inside. And if a dumb bubble sort, which is 6 lines of code, fully deterministic, nowhere to hide, 6 lines of code, if that thing is doing things that we did not expect and we did not ask it to do, and by ask, I mean there are no steps in the algorithm to do what it's doing, then I don't, who knows what these language models are doing. But I'm pretty sure that just watching the language output is not a really good guide to what's happening. I think we have to go back to the very beginning, and we have to apply the kinds of things that Anil was talking about, which is basic behavioral testing in various spaces. I think our imagination is really poor at this. I think we have to just be really creative as far as asking what is this thing actually doing, specifically in the spaces between the algorithm, because the thing is, it has to. It's a little bit like this is a crazy kind of a crazy analogy that I came up with the other day. This notion of steganography. So in steganography, you take let's say a piece of data. Let's say it's an image. It's a JPEG, and it looks like whatever it looks like. There are bits within that image that if you were to change those bits, it wouldn't look any different. Right? There's some degrees of freedom in there that you can move things around and the image would still look the same. And so what people do is they hide information in there, and maybe it's your signature that you are the one who took the picture, or maybe maybe it's a code because you're a spy. Whatever it is, you hide information in there. But the iron rule is you can't mess up the primary picture. You can sneak stuff in to the degrees of freedom, but you can't mess with the primary picture or the primary data pattern, because then it will be obvious that something's there. I kind of have a feeling that this is what's going on, not just with computer algorithms, but with everything. There is the primary thing it's supposed to do, and anything else that it gets to do has to be compatible with that primary thing. It isn't magic. You can't break the laws of physics. You can't go against the algorithm, right? You're not doing things that the algorithm forbids. But it turns out, I think, that there are these weird empty spaces between the algorithm where you can do, and I mean, doesn't that describe to some extent our existential? You have a certain bit of time in this world. You have to be consistent with those laws of physics. Eventually, your physical body gets ground down to entropy and whatever. But until then, you can do some cool stuff that isn't forbidden by the laws of physics, nor is it prescribed by those laws, I don't think. And so you get this. This is what I think is really interesting about these things. And the algorithm itself, to the extent that it has to do the algorithm, that limits what else it can do. In a sense, what it's doing is in spite of the algorithm, not because of it. And so I agree with Anil here. I'm not a computationalist. I don't think anything is conscious because of the algorithm. If anything, I think the mental properties it has is in spite of the thing we force it to do. And so one thing, and then I'll stop here. One thing which I'm sort of most proud of in that paper that I think was kind of cool is that we figured out a way to let off the pressure on the algorithm a little bit to see what would happen. And the way you do that now, how would you do that? It has to follow the algorithm. How could you possibly let off the pressure? What we did was we allowed duplicate numbers in the sort. And what that allows you to do is you still have all the fives still have to end up before the sixes, and that has to go before the sevens and so on. But how you arrange those is now not really constrained by the algorithm. You don't change the algorithm. You just allow multiple repeats within the. And what did we see? We saw that the crazy thing it was doing, which I call clustering. I could tell you what that is, but it doesn't matter. It went up higher than when you couldn't. Than when we didn't let it do that. And so I really think, and this comes back to the AI thing. I really think that it's a lot like raising kids in the following sense. To the extent that you force them to do specific things, you squelch down on the intrinsic motivation. Some kid that's forced to be in a class all day, you're not going to get to see what else he would be doing otherwise. Maybe it's out playing soccer, who knows what it would be. And so to the extent that we force these things to do specific things, we are actually we're reducing what else they might do. And that's what we need to develop is the tools to detect and to facilitate this intrinsic motivation. And then you get into alignment and all of that.
That reminds me a lot of when I was doing my postdoc 20 odd years ago, coming across, being told by my mentor at the time, Gerald Edelman, about the distinction between redundancy and degeneracy. I think this is very apposite here. So, engineering people often talk about having redundancy within a system. So if a system is designed to do something, to follow some steps in an algorithm, well, then you might want multiple copies in case something goes wrong, you have a backup. But the backup is doing the same thing. It's redundant in that sense. Biological systems don't seem to be like that. They exhibit degeneracy rather than redundancy. That is, they may have multiple ways of doing the same thing in context A, but in context B, these multiple ways of doing the same thing now do different things. So this is hinting at the same thing that although it looks like they're doing the same thing, there's actually some spaces in between somewhere that you won't see unless you look in different contexts. Otherwise, you'll only see the same process that might look like an algorithm. And it's that degeneracy that gives biological systems their kind of open-endedness, their ability to adapt to novel situations and so on. It might be related to what Mike is calling an intrinsic motivation, that you have to have some kind of degeneracy rather than redundancy to systems.
I mean, what's interesting to me is that people are often, with the exception of a few like diehard, reductionist materialists, whatever, people are generally pretty willing to grant living things that, right? And they're okay with saying that, living things, especially brainy living things, get to do some of those things. But what I'm now finding is that people get very upset when I suggest that the same thing might be true all the way down. It seems to be very important that we have this distinction No, that's the dead matter and the mere machines. We are special. We can do this thing. And my point is not, I'm not trying to mechanize living things. I'm going in the opposite direction. I'm saying there's not less mind than you think there is. I think there's more. But actually, especially people kind of organicist thinkers who really resist the mechanization of life and all this stuff. They really get really upset. They really get upset at this last part because if I suppose we're not as special if it goes all. I'm not sure. I think there's some kind of a scarcity mindset that there's not enough mind for all of us.
Maybe I think it might be that there's still this worry that even if you're like, say, bubble sort again. I mean, bubble sort is still implemented on like standard computers, right? So one way of potentially misunderstanding what you're saying is you're then basically allowing computational functionalism by the back door again in some ways by saying, look, an algorithm like bubble sort has actually all the things that you need, or it has so much more going on than what one might think. So let's not be too quick to rule out substrate independent algorithms as sufficient for other things that might seem otherwise hard to explain. In biology.
I think you're right, and I think people could, but in that would be a misinterpretation of what I'm saying. I am not saying that it's doing that because of the algorithm, right? So the standard computationalist theory is you are conscious because your algorithm is doing workspace theory, whatever it's doing, right? That's why you are. I'm saying the exact opposite. I'm saying that even something as stripped down and forced to the stupid algorithm, there are still spaces there through which whatever this is whatever this magic is that we're talking about is able to squeeze in even there. There are minimal versions of it that will shine through even there. And if you provide a more a different interface, and I don't want to just say more complex because I don't think it's just complexity. Maybe it's materials, maybe it's some other stuff. But if you provide better interfaces such as living materials, well, then sure, you'll get way more. But this stuff seeps into even the most constrained systems, I think.
The Economist covers math, physics, philosophy, and AI in a manner that shows how different countries perceive developments and how they impact markets. They recently published a piece on China's new neutrino detector. They cover extending life via mitochondrial transplants, creating an entirely new field of medicine. But it's also not just science. They analyze culture, they analyze finance, economics, business, international affairs across every region. I'm particularly liking their new Insider feature. It was just launched this month. It gives me a front row access to The Economist's internal editorial debates, where senior editors argue through the news with world leaders and policymakers in twice weekly long format shows. Basically, an extremely high-quality podcast. Whether it's scientific innovation or shifting global politics, The Economist provides comprehensive coverage beyond headlines. As a TOE listener, you get a special discount. Head over to economist.com/TOE to subscribe. That's economist.com/TOE for your discount.